Slingenberg, the Director of Strategy, Analysis and Planning at DG Klima of the European Commission, Sarah Mathieu, Green MEP, Roger Matala, the Chief Sustainability Officer of company GE Vernova, and Manon Dufour, the Executive Director of the Brussels office of E3G. Welcome. And another quick programming note for those of you in the audience here in the room, we will have 10 minutes for questions at the end. So do think about what you might want to ask our wonderful panelists here. Those will be the last 10 minutes of our discussion here. And thank you so much for joining me today here. We're a couple of days into the new term of the new commission, so very fresh everything. But I think it's still great to talk about where are we heading on EU green policies and the European Green Deal in particular. And I actually would like to start with Yvonne with a question, which is that do we even have still a European Green Deal, or is it now all about the clean industrial deal?
Thank you, Zia, and thanks for having us. Thanks for being on a very nice panel, and of course, very good opening session with Minister Ryan. I think the answer is affirmative, because I think for those of us who are in the Brussels bubble for a long time, yes, there are sometimes new framings, new responses to people's concerns, etc. But I think Mrs. von der Leyen has been very clear that we are staying the course on achieving our targets, and I think that is absolutely key in terms of predictability. There was, of course, I would say, since the European elections and even before that, quite some discussion of whether we should be doing that, and I think the debate has been incredibly useful to say, yes, there is no alternative, we have to do this, it's good for our security, it's good for our independence, it's good for the prosperity of the people. And I could talk about how, indeed, I would agree with the Minister that that requires a lot of discussion with the people and in the member states, and to talk that through. What are the options and what are the benefits? What are the costs as well? What do we need to do? But I mean, I don't know whether you want to immediately, get me going on all of that.
Actually, I want to briefly go to Sarah and ask, are you convinced, I guess, or do you have any concerns about the direction of travel going forward?
Well, of course we are concerned because we do see quite some backlash when it comes to the Green Deal. It would be weird to say anything different. And indeed, there has been, I would say, at the last part of the mandate, some backlash that required a big political battle, not to mention, for instance, the nature restoration law, of course, I think you are all aware, and some other files, for instance, when it comes to agriculture. But I would say the glass is really half full. I think it's clear that we are standing ground, indeed, when it comes to implementation of a lot of the important laws, for instance, Fit for 55, that also Eamon just referred to. I think it's clear when you look at the mission letters, for instance, there's a very clear horizontal reference to the Green Deal for all members of the new college. So I think that it's very clear that that commitment is there. And I mean, indeed, and I agree with you, it's also sometimes a question of the narrative, because indeed now it seems everything is about the clean industrial deal. I actually think it's a good thing that we are talking about the greening of our industry, about what kind of European policies we need, what kind of investment we will need to push it all through. And you could say that it's now more framed as a competitiveness agenda, but I think that's also right in the sense that the Green Deal is the best thing we could do for our competitiveness. Of course, it's also important for the climate, it's also important, for our quality of life and for making sure that nature and biodiversity is kept protected. But in that sense, for me, it's more like, okay, what are now the next steps we need to take? And I think, indeed, the greening of our industry and a clean industrial deal is a big part of that.
And Manon, if you were to be able to demand 3 things of the new Commission on the European Green Deal, on the Clean Industrial Deal, what would those be?
Wow. I mean, I think it's on the Clean Industrial Deal, for instance, which is likely to be one of the first things we see, is to make it, like, to be focused on the objective, which is to have, like, a resilient, fair, and kind of green transition. Mm-hmm. And that's going to take a few things. I mean, it's not just about the appeal of doing yet another kind of, meaningless industrial strategy, but actually kind of pushing the dial a bit further. I think there's a bit of a risk of the kind of deregulation sirens, so I think simplification so that policies are more effective, there's less burden, totally, but they have to be objective-driven and not kind of politically driven, and I think there's some risk there, so I think it's about being clear on the overall objective. And maybe kind of here, like coming back to what Minister Ryan was saying, I think we do have to be aware of our dependency on the rest of the world and the fact that Europe does need international cooperation, does need international climate action, and we shouldn't be maybe overdoing it on a protectionism and like being able to kind of create meaningful partnerships with like emerging economies as well. And that should be an objective in itself, I think, in designing a new industrial strategy. So.
Okay, and before we get into all of that, Roger, GE Vernova, American company, what's your interest in a European Green Deal? What makes you pay attention to EU climate policies?
Well, thank you for asking. So GE Vernova is this global company, and our equipment helps produce 25% of the world's energy in more than 100 countries. And in Europe, it's more than 30% of the energy in Europe, 25,000 employees, 60 sites, manufacturing facilities. So we feel very much like a European company on most days. And the reason we're so interested in investing in Europe is, of all the places in the world, Europe has the most kind of unqualified passion and conviction about the energy transition, about decarbonization. You've always led, you're going to continue to lead, and the rest of the world's kind of catching up to that conviction. And so we know EU is going to lead, is going to be the proof point, the leading edge of decarbonization, proving the technologies, proving these goals, proving these targets. And how do you innovate to get to the climate change goals? I think what we're seeing in the discussion today and what we fully embrace is something that we see with this global lens has been the industrial side of it, that the rest of the world has seen not only the decarbonization agenda, but they've really seen this as the space race of this generation, that this is the next Silicon Valley. And so whether they are as big believers in climate change as the EU or not, it doesn't really matter. Like look at the UAE and COP28, kind of investing the future of its economy on the energy transition. And I think that's where the Draghi report, where Europe now, by focusing on this connection between green and growth and the industrialization, the economic development part of it, that's been this link that we're really embracing. And so GE Vernova, with our factories, with our manufacturing, with our innovation, we're here to help facilitate not only improving the decarbonization goals, but the economic benefits that derive from that and the electrification benefits, because the world needs energy, Europe needs energy. And I think this, what Commissioner Draghi has done is frame this in a really productive way to make sure he's succeeding on all of those fronts.
Right, and given that, and we do have, as Sarah briefly touched on, some conversations around perhaps our 2030 targets are a bit too difficult to reach. Perhaps we need to, tweak them a little bit. Perhaps we need to roll back some of that. And I'm wondering how you see that. Sorry, Roger.
Oh, for me. We encourage the ambitiousness of the target. Again, the EU's role, I think, in the world is not only to solve this for the EU, but to be the proof point, to be the leading edge that you can meet these targets, you can use renewable energy, you can innovate the next generation of decarbonization technologies. One of the things that we think is a real strength, and this comes from the prior conversation with the Commissioner, is the diversity of the member states. That the EU has set clear goals, but the member states have their own national identities in terms of how to get there. They want to be all of the above, technology neutral, betting on different types of technologies that fit their geographies, that fit their policies. And so to us, we really encourage the EU to embrace that because it allows a lot of innovation across the EU for the benefit of those member nations, for the benefit of the EU, and different pathways. I think if you were to just say, we're going to get to this goal and we're going to prejudge how to get there for the entire continent, that would not lead to success. But by setting goals and then enabling the the member nations to kind of figure what's the best technology mix, the best innovation mix to get there. It gives us a lot of optimism that you're going to solve along the way. Maybe not everyone will be right, maybe some will work and some won't. But by having kind of that test bed of the different technologies, we think is a real strength to help realize those goals.
Okay, and before we talk about what's ahead, I want to continue looking backward a little bit. And Yvonne, I'm curious, I mean, especially given that like some of this backlash that we kind of saw over the past year, is there anything that you would say, you know, maybe looking back, this is something we would have done different? Is there any, you know, lessons that you're taking forward as you work on, as the Commission works on, like the post-2030 climate framework?
Thank you. Yes, I think we do, because we are, of course, now looking at the next step, you know, which is a 2040 target, and also the policies that will be needed for that, the enabling conditions, targets, what have you. But when we do that, we are very conscious of the fact that, of course, right now we first need to focus on implementation, meeting the 2030 goals. And it was a little bit striking that, you know, having negotiated this big package, Minister Ryan said, you know, 25 proposals, I don't actually even remember the exact number. It probably went very fast. And it probably was a lot concentrated here in, you know, between the institutions. It did respond to a call from, you know, citizens, because we had all these, you know, climate strikes, etc. So I think also President von der Leyen was like, yes, we will do this. The Green Deal, the very comprehensive approach, you know, so many things in a coherent manner at the same way to really kind of, you know, bring things together and be coherent about that. But it, of course, meant a lot in the sense of, you know, now having to transpose, now having to try and do these things, the different actors, also for the member states, I have to say. I mean, you're right, they have to kind of also think things through. What are my choices? What are my, you know, priorities? The technological choices as well, the infrastructure choices, the planning choices, and that is a process we're now in. We have, of course, asked member states to look at their national energy and climate plans, which is pretty much, I always say, look, they're called climate and energy plans, but they're pretty much economy-wide, because you have to see about, you know, your space, indeed, your strong points, your weak points, your resilience. How do you get the citizens on board? And I think that has been, with hindsight, probably not overlooked, but I mean, it was not the focus of attention back then when we were negotiating. It was also still COVID times. So I think people are now finding out that, you know, that should be done differently, and I think that's actually what we're now seeing. That is, like you were saying, Sarah, I mean, it is fair to ask those questions and to say, okay, there are bottlenecks, right? There are trade-offs, there are dilemmas. We need the citizen support. So I think we're very much trying to do things differently from that perspective. And yeah, we will. I think it's also very encouraging that there does seem to be this very strong readiness to sit together and to see, okay, where are the bottlenecks? How can we deal with this? Of course, that would inevitably lead to perhaps, you know, small adjustments, not to divert from the course or to divert from the goals. Let me be very clear. But I mean, to recognize that in the real world, there are simply things that have either changed, you know, or that didn't turn out to be completely coherent, and we would need to look at that. So yes, I think we have indeed, we try to learn our lesson. Yeah.
Right, yeah. Manon, do you have any thoughts on like how the EU, especially, you know, the policymakers here could, you know, perhaps get more buy-in from Europeans? Like, is there something, like when we're talking about this, what are some of like the ideas that could be useful?
I think, I mean, I'm not going to answer your question. I think there's a lot of ideas. There's lots of different kind of schemes or ways to ensure buy-in, and it comes from like, I don't know, addressing more headfront, like building resilience, for instance, against climate impacts, or helping them through, I don't know, pickup of electric vehicles. I don't know if it's like social leasing, or if it's about like more affordable and kind of green and resilient housing. But like all of this kind of comes back to the fact that I think we have a good framework, but I think what's getting more and more clear is just the investment tag that this requires, and I think that's almost like the first step is to to kind of build consensus and kind of unlock some of the political deadlocks we have on the funding side, so that member states, kind of cities, regions can drive it through. Now, yeah, I mean, there is a collection of measures that can be taken to help this. But the investment will be crucial, because I think at the end of the day it's about accompanying citizens as well. And I think maybe one of the things that the lessons that we had from the kind of the Green Deal, which actually the Commission kind of tackled at some point, was maybe not initially thinking through the social dimension. And so we had kind of the whole ETS2 discussion that started kind of, the cost on consumers was starting to become more pressing, and then the social climate plans, the social climate plan was thought through. But this was maybe a bit of an afterthought. So I think we've learned that lesson, and we do need to be a lot more upfront about this. Now it's about preparing the economy so that when these measures hit, and when there's, I mean, we're still very reliant on kind of volatile fossil fuel prices and how to shield people from it. And the answer, I mean, is quite clear, is kind of electrification. And I think we are quite clear on the priority. It's about kind of delivering it fast enough, I think, and also being aware of like where to start as well. I think there will be very kind of clear distributional impacts, not two kind of region, not two kind of class of citizens will be impacted. And I think most member states and regions and the EU need to be a lot more aware of these impacts to make kind of these investment decisions together.
And Sarah, is there anything Parliament should do differently going forward?
Well, I completely agree with what you said on what could have been different, and I think we as a Parliament, we did push for quite some of those things, and well, I think we need to push even harder to make sure that indeed this buy-in is there, because I mean we have to recognize that we are living in very difficult times. You know, people are feeling quite insecure, I think, when you look at the geopolitical situation, when you look at the different wars that are going on, but also when you look at inequalities, also when you look at, for instance, the industrialization and the loss of jobs that we are seeing all over Europe. And that is something really we need to address. And I think indeed, well, we haven't addressed it firmly enough. It was too much of an afterthought. And people felt like, oh, you know, there's so many things that are coming ahead of us that we need to deal with. They didn't see the benefits for them. And I think that that's really crucial if you want to have buy-in, if you want to have public support for your environmental and climate measures. So for me, that means, for instance, when it comes to ETS2, we need a bigger social climate fund. We need to make sure that, well, the people that are now living in energy poverty actually get the support that they need. And I mean, that makes sense on a social part, but that also really makes sense on a more structural energy efficiency, renewables, etc. agenda. That means, for instance, when we're looking at the Clean Industrial Deal, that there need to be very clear social conditionalities. For instance, when it comes to the investment that I think that we really need to unleash. Right now, it's not clear yet what that will entail. Okay, there might be a competitiveness fund. It's not clear where the money is going to come from. We have seen, for instance, the Draghi report indeed that says we need, you know, major investment, both public and private. I agree with that, but for me it also means, well, if then companies want to have support for the greening of their industries and processes. It means good working conditions. It means decent wages. It means giving people the opportunity to skill and reskill. It means good child support and you know all of these things where you can actually make workers and people the winners of the transition. It's the same, for instance, with public procurement. I think one of the big files that is also up and ahead, where I think there's a lot of taxpayers' money that is still not being spent in the right way, where we need more environmental and social conditions. So, you know, there's really an opportunity there, I think, for a new social contract that is linked to the Green Deal. And I think that's really one of the things that we as a parliament should fight for and put on the agenda of the Commission.
And Yvonne, is that something that the Commission is open to?
Well, when we chatted last week before this panel, I was saying, look, the new commission has started yesterday or on Sunday, but I mean, it is, of course, a little bit difficult, but I think these kind of concerns do resonate in, President von der Leyen's guidelines, in the mission letters, etc. We will definitely look at that. I think there is a lot that can be done. I mean, you mentioned the Social Climate Fund. By summer, the member states have to hand in their draft social climate plans, and of course discussions are ongoing. I think it all starts by indeed identifying what the current situation is, what is driving what also, because, and I kind of, forgot to mention, but of course, the energy prices was not really caused by any climate policy. So yes, we will also need to look at the energy market, how we can further improve that, building on everybody's strengths, but I think it is very, very important to look at, what are good practices. There are good practices around. I mean, one of the examples we always give is the social leasing for electrical vehicles in France. Yes, the budget ran out very, very quickly. So, I mean, that needs to be planned better, right? And probably every member state needs to really look at, okay, who needs this kind of support, and what kind of support are we giving so that they can move out of this, difficulty with high energy prices. That is really the objective. So, but I do agree that, it will come down to public funding, also private funding. I mean, I think the Draghi report is very clearly putting its finger on that aspect where, we need to, again, talk to people and make them see that these are worthwhile investments, for those people who can afford it, which is also a big kind of challenge because, I mean, there is also this, notion that, well, why should I do this? It's uncertain, the heat pumps, should I do it now? Should I not do it? Do we have the installers? Will I get good advice? It's a hassle. So yes, there is a lot of work to be done. And I do agree on the social side and the dialogue side, and, that needs to improve. I wanted to nevertheless add that, that again can not only happen in Brussels. And it's great that we're having this, long summit, but I mean, it will need to happen in the member states in a constructive manner, because I think that's also very often lacking. I mean, people immediately take sides, and it kind of takes away this opportunity to really, in a kind of much more objective manner, look at, okay, what is coming towards us? I mean, are we going to, is it really an option to go back to being dependent on more gas or more LNG, or, what? It's not an option, and I think people were very clear that this is the way forward for Europeans' competitiveness, but also for prosperity in the end, in order to nevertheless mitigate our emissions and prepare better for what nevertheless will be coming. So all these things need to be brought together. We need to have that debate, and then to look at, okay, what is really needed, and how do we bring public funding in a very targeted manner together with private funding. And, there are some streams that can also be used. We're always happy to mention the ETS revenues, which nevertheless is has a substantial amount of money behind it, billions, and we will be discussing also with member states how they're using that money, how they bring it together, blend it with public money to really, get the necessary infrastructure and other investments going.
Yeah, and I know we're like 2 or 3 days into the new term and you can't tell us much, but can you give us a sense of sort of the top priorities for the next year that you're now starting work on?
Yes, we are, in the coming year, I think Mrs. von der Leyen has been very clear about the priorities. I mean, we will definitely be looking to come out with a clean industrial deal, and that will, as usual, set the tone for the follow-up measures that will need to come. So we have also Industrial Decarbonization Accelerator Act then coming. We will have indeed actions on just transition. I think the multi-annual financial framework is going to be inevitably a big one that should also be coming out in 2025, because that will really be the trigger on where we can prioritize things to go. And of course, how the MFF will be supporting the clean energy transition, I think, is going to be absolutely key, because we all know that, it's not only public money, but it will need to trigger the private funding coming in. We will, as I said, work a lot in implementation. I think it is quite novel that, each of the commissioners have also been given a very clear task to work on that, to work on simplification. I think, as you were saying, Manon, that's absolutely fine. If we're not going to give the impression that this means, not going ahead with things, because that is not the point. So it is about how do we make this implementation happen. I think at the same time, we will be looking to the next step. I already mentioned it, the 2040 target, and also the enabling measures to get there. So this is kind of a continuum. How do we make sure we step up on implementation for the 2030 targets, because that will, of course, be necessary for a 2040 target. Now, if we brought out the communication on the 2040 target with a recommended target earlier this year, it was in February, and I think there it is very clear that we also have huge challenges. It will no longer be the energy sector only that can do this. That is why it is so important that we also look at the decarbonization of energy-intensive industry. Of course, that we continue to promote the clean technologies, renewable energy, other low-carbon technologies, but also other sectors. And I think transport is a very big one. Agriculture is a very big one. And there, maybe I close in saying that President von der Leyen has also promised to come out with a vision for a sustainable future of agriculture. And I think that will also be very important. How do we also acknowledge the big concerns that have been out there, which probably, to a large extent, were also legitimate, and people feeling that this was not, discussed with them. So we need to try and do that better as well. Things have started over the last year with the strategic dialogue, but I mean, all these things will be pursued further, I'm sure. Yeah.
Okay. Manon, does that match your expectations? Is there anything you were missing in that list?
You mean my expectation for what needs to happen or what will happen? I mean, I think this is quite clear on these are the things that are coming.
Yes.
First, I mean, if I can answer by in a very think tank way,
Please.
but I think we had basically 6 things we need to see for a kind of a fast and fair transition in Europe with a positive impact globally. And so there is something about the stability of the trajectory. So I think a 2040 target is very important, but also the signals that we're sending to investors in particular on are we rolling back, are we not? And I think that can have very negative impact, even if the rollback doesn't happen. This impression is very, very negative. There does need to be a push on industry decarbonization, but also kind of strengthening the industrial kind of capacity in Europe. I think this is a matter of kind of economic resilience to some extent, but also just political resilience for this project, given the geopolitical context. And I think this is quite promising, what we're hearing. A push on social, the social dimension, or even just at large, the social contract. I think this is where I think we have a few words, the actual hooks or decision. I mean, again, it's not necessarily like a EU level only thing, but I think that this will need to be integrated throughout. And I do see that action on climate resilience and adaptation is maybe one of the things that we're missing from the past mandates that I think we hear from President von der Leyen and I think there's more to do there that will kind of yield benefits. Really finishing up, I mean, I agree, energy is maybe not the sole driver, but this is the thing we need to get kind of locked in. So we need to basically be energy secure or have put things in place to kind of finalize this. It's getting off Russian gas, but it's also really hedging against LNG volatility. And we know how to do it. It's just about kind of rolling it out. And finally, the 2 things are, again, investment, private and public, and having just a meaningful kind of foreign action, kind of external action policy that both promotes but also takes up clean energy opportunity, clean economy opportunities. I think we have elements of it all. The uncertainty clearly at this stage is how are the kind of trickier politics are going to play out in the parliament. Clearly, the past few weeks have been a little scary. I mean, we've never seen that level of polarization and fragmentation, and I kind of hope we can put this behind us, because this is not necessarily beneficial for anyone in Europe. I think so I think that's a risk, and to what extent the prioritization will take place between some of the objectives that we have at hand.
Yeah. I'll come back to that in a second about the polarization. But Roger, I wanted to ask you, what are you looking for in terms of this promise of a clean industrial deal, what is you sort of looking forward to from the Europeans?
Thank you. I think from a private sector perspective, there's 2 things, and Yvonne touched on one of them, which is the financing side. I mean, it'd be very easy for me to say subsidize things, financing. I understand, I'm a pragmatic person, so we want to be reasonable. You said something really resonated, which was targeted public financing, which I think is, we're not going to ask you to create the Inflation Reduction Act here. We know that's not realistic, but I think some targeted financing, whether that's focused on companies like GE Vernova, which are manufacturing, we want to invest here. We have a lot of incentives to invest here because of the policies. So something that promotes domestic manufacturing or domestic supply chain, or something that sends good signals to our customers who are producing the energy using our equipment through some incentivization there. So some notion of targeted financing, I think, could be enough to kind of catalyze the type of private sector investing you need. So financing is part of it. But I would actually say just as important, if not even more important, is just regulatory certainty to some extent, knowing that if we're going to make the big stake investments here in a factory or in building offshore wind turbines or onshore wind turbines or electrification equipment, that you have that certainty of environment. And one of the things, like the EU has a reputation for bureaucracy and delays, so does the US. We have that in common. But one of the things that's been really impressive to me is learning about Germany. And Germany has, I think, kind of set the example for the Western world of permitting reform. They have something called renewable acceleration areas. And earlier this year, the first quarter of the year, I think they approved 480 onshore turbines, wind turbines, 40% more than the year ahead. Like, people aren't talking about that, at least from what I'm seeing for some reason. In the US, we're very focused on permitting reform. And if the EU can kind of create a more certain investing environment, I think that's even more important than the financing, frankly, because if we know we can make an investment, our customers can make an investment, it's going to get through within a year or 2 years, as Germany is committing to do, and you've got all that, that's going to create the right demand signals, and you're going to see people really wanting to kind of come here and prioritize those investments. So a combination of financing, but even bigger weight on addressing the permitting, addressing the regulatory certainty, having good workforce, having good supply chain, and people eager to kind of invest in this industry, sign up for jobs, and being willing to prove out the technologies.
Yeah, that links to what Sarah was saying about, like, what do you think about the idea of, does European investment having social conditionalities?
Social conditionalities?
Yeah, like kind of like be attached to conditions, like Sarah mentioned about like good quality jobs,
yes,
or like similar, like, like social rights and so on.
Understood. And yes, our approach would be, if we're going to build a factory, there should be a commitment that so many of those jobs come from underserved communities, that we're going in and doing STEM education, that we're inspiring the next generation of leaders, something we've already committed and invested to do. And we'll do that even without factories. Like, we're happy to go into any community and do STEM education and really inspire people. But we certainly think those social aspects in 2024, 2025 should be part of understanding who you're doing business with. And we talk about, you talked about making sure everybody, energy poverty, and everybody has access. In 2023, we put 29 gigawatts of capacity onto the grid, 64 gigawatts of grid equipment energized. And the carbon intensity of that capacity was 25% below the carbon intensity of the grid as a whole. So we put more electrification capacity on the grid. We lowered the emissions. But at the same time, more than 40% of that capacity went to emerging and developing economies. And so we see this commitment to make sure we're not just picking up the phone in the order in which it rings, but that we're affirmatively looking at who is underserved, 700 million people in the world, and how do we affirmatively invest in those areas so that everybody has access to prosperity, the same opportunities to live a prosperous life, where energy is really the lifeblood of that.
Before I come to you, Sarah, I see Yvonne taking notes about permitting. Is that German-style system something that the Commission is perhaps looking to integrate into future European proposals?
Well, to my understanding, this has already been enabled in the last package. So, I mean, this is indeed about implementation, and that's where absolutely comparing between member states, how are people doing it, how do you then also explain it to the citizens, because of course there may be concerns that the environmental impact assessments, etc., are overridden. Well, that shouldn't be the case, right? There is really a lot of merit, in my view, in this notion that member states can also indicate which areas, and that was like the political choices I've referred to earlier. I mean, when you look at your country, okay, where do we have strong wind? Where do we have a lot of sun? How are we going to roll out rooftop solar, etc.? What is our grid capacity there, and what is needed? And if you can bring that story in a coherent and compelling manner to the citizens, I think will also make it much more easy to talk about permitting. And there is a lot that can be done. I learned the other day also that, like in my country, in Holland, when they did the offshore auctions for offshore wind, a lot of the upstream requirements in terms of permitting and infrastructure was actually taken care of by the government. So, I mean, there are lots of things that can be done that can then help speed up. So let's see. It's again coming down to implementation. Of course, we're as I said, happy to discuss what may perhaps still be needed in terms of legislation. But I think a lot, in fact, also on the energy side, in the electricity market side, has now been legislated, but a lot comes down to implementation. Of course, this also takes a little bit of time, but it's very urgent.
Sarah, do you want to come back on any of that? Or?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to indeed this agenda on the permitting, I think indeed Europe has taken quite some important steps indeed when it comes to renewable energy, for instance, and it's really now up to the member states to make sure that it happens. But we also need to be careful there that we don't go too far or see it as like the silver bullet, because it's not. I mean, and one of the big discussions I think that is still to come is, for instance, what about our critical raw materials? What about, for instance, mining in Europe, where I think it wouldn't be a good idea to just say, let's speed up the permitting without really looking into the environmental impact, without really looking at, for instance, public support and buy-in for those that live around one of those sites. So we need to be careful in not using it as a way to backslide. And in that sense, indeed, I mean, I don't have an issue, or I even support the fact that we should go for a simplification of some of the rules, because I do see that for some companies right now, it's quite an administrative burden. There are ways of cutting some of the red tape without losing our targets and really the principles of our legislation. But we also need to make sure that we don't then see that being used as a way of lessening those targets. And I mean, of course, that is now really also part of the discussion. For instance, when you look at CO2 for cars, when you look at deforestation regulation, I mean, what companies always tell me, and it has been said indeed also on this panel, we need to have clear rules and we need to have predictability. So, I mean, the worst thing you could do is, well, backtrack, say that we come back from certain targets. I mean, that will kill innovation, that will really kill investment. So that's not what we should do and the agenda that we should drive for. I think one of the things that hasn't been mentioned yet when it comes to the more imminent political agenda that I do want to bring to the table is the Circular Economy Act, because I do think it's very important on a lot of levels. I mean, that is really about our environmental footprint, of course, because people seem to forget that, well, our material footprint is quite large if you look at the rest of the world and what we are now consuming when it comes to raw materials. So I think for me, that's really one of those things where we need targets and we need clear pathways on how to reduce that. And I mean, that also means that there are a lot of economical benefits and opportunities when it comes to refurbishing, repair, also recycling, that cannot be offshored as easily as has been the case with, like, the making industry. So for me, it's a real opportunity. I think that there's a lot of buy-in from the new Commission as well, and I expect there to be from the Parliament. And maybe lastly, to make just transition a bit more, well, tangible. For me, it's not just a question of the Social Climate Fund, for instance, and social conditionality. I really think we need to have legislation there on the anticipation and management of change. It's something that we've been talking to the Commission about, where there is a certain openness, also from, for instance, from Commissioner Minsatu, making sure that indeed the workers are at the center of this transition. So I hope that that also will be one of those things that we can expect in the coming months and years as a very clear policy goal.
Okay, before we turn over to audience questions, which we will be in a minute, I wanted to ask each of our panelists for some closing thoughts, and particularly I would ask for some reflections on the current, vibes in the broader world. We have a Trump administration coming in, which is very skeptical of climate policies. We have polarization in the European Parliament, a rightward shift in Europe. And I'm wondering if each of you could just briefly maybe reflect on that and what it will mean for green policy going forward in Europe. And I think let's just go left to right. Let's start with Sarah and then move down to...
Well, I think it means that we have a huge responsibility as Europe and as European lawmakers to give answers to that, because indeed the geopolitical situation is very difficult right now. Luckily, I would say within Europe we have the transition not to waste a good crisis and to thrive out of it. I would say that sometimes it really takes us too long, but still. We need to rise to the occasion, and that also means for me in the Parliament, when it comes to recent polarization and the debates, that it's really up to the pro-European democratical forces to stick together and really deliver on that, because I think that that's really what people are expecting us to do. And I mean, well, you won't be surprised, of course, that for me that also means furthering the agenda when it comes to Green Deal and the Clean Industrial Deal for sure. But it also means, going the extra mile, finding those compromises, really prioritizing. And it also means that we need to think about our role as Europe in the world. Because, well, we haven't talked a lot about the trade dimension, but I think it's an important one indeed. And I mean, time is limited. But I think it's really up to us as Europe, when you look at the US, when you look at China, when it comes about protectionism, when it comes about the level playing field and ensuring that, but also really we need to stretch out our hand to those developing countries and give them a better deal, really give them a deal when it comes to, for instance, our need for critical raw materials, to make sure that they actually benefit from it, that there is tech transfer, that there is, a common sharing of innovation, and well, it also means, I would say, remuneration in the sense that we need to invest. We need to invest in the rest of the world if we want to make sure that they thrive, if we want to make sure that they also tackle climate change, if we want to make sure that indeed we lessen the dependencies that we have right now in our supply chain. So, it's also really an inward responsibility when it comes to, the coherence of the European project, but also an outwards responsibility reaching out to the rest of the world.
Yeah, thank you. And Manon?
I think so Europe is kind of the first continent when it comes to decarbonization. They're kind of spearheading. It's always been a pathfinder. And I think that new phase of the transition focused on implementation was never going to be easy. That's where the hard work starts. Of course, it's happening at a time where geopolitically and politically things are hard anyway. So this is clearly a difficult phase for everybody, which kind of forces us to, which happened already, to have a more mature, more kind of compromise-building kind of approach to it. And I think that's what we're going to have to do. What worries me is sometimes, that kind of politicization, kind of polarization, because we are going to need people to come together to find a path that is politically resilient, that speaks to different values, but recognizing that, and I think there is still massive agreement and alignment on this, that economic security, economic resilience, and kind of safety relies on climate action. And whether it's climate mitigation or kind of climate adaptation, there's no other way. There's no kind of other alternative path for Europe in having kind of a safe and competitive, or even just a prosperous future. So that does mean that I think people like us, like the CSOs, a lot of the businesses, clearly the politicians will have to actually kind of come together to find a solution. It sounds really wishy-washy, but I think this is basically the hard work starts. And yeah, I mean, everyone has a role to play, and that's what we're going to have to do. We have kind of 5 years to make it work until the next elections and have more buy-in. So I think that's it's kind of clear in that way.
Yeah. And Roger?
I agree with the proposition of your question. A lot of change in the world. 25% of the world went to the polls last year, not just in the United States, and a lot in Europe as well. And coming back from COP29, where I appreciate Europe showed up in full force, I saw a couple of things that I think give me some optimism. One is the world is electrifying. I think we're in a once-in-our-lifetime opportunity to invest in the grid, make investments at scale all over the world in the grid for a lot of different reasons we don't have time to get into right now. But those investments in the grid are the long overdue opportunities to address climate change and decarbonization at the same time. We talked about how our capacity actually brought down carbon intensity. So for a variety of reasons, we have, I think, this overdue opportunity to be investing in climate and decarbonization because of the electrification imperative. We didn't get to talk too much today about investing in the grid itself and actually upgrading grid infrastructure, but Europe has come on board with this, which we strongly support. This is the quickest, fastest, most cost-efficient way to get at both of those goals. We talked about the connection to industrialization, to economic development, jobs, and security, which we fully supported. And in the private sector, we're here to help the EU succeed on that. And then finally, I think the last thing is the role of innovation and technology. The private sector, I think, is increasingly leading in the innovation space, but in collaboration with the public sector. Unprecedented private-public sector partnerships. This is our way for moving forward. Ukraine's been a great example of this. And so the opportunity to do this together through partnerships, I think, will unlock a lot of success for Europe and for the world.
And finally, Yvonne.
Thanks a lot. That was very encouraging to hear that from you, Roger. I mean, I would echo what others have said. I think, I hope with the start of this mandate, we can have a bit of a, new consensus on this direction where we're heading. And I think it's been really quite useful, the past year to look at it from all sides. Are we sure? Should we do things differently, etc.? But I mean, now I think we're at a moment where we should get on with it. I mean, I think we can. I very much liked your concept of a proof point. I think that's what Europe has always been doing. I mean, Minister Ryan also said it. Our credibility in Europe relies on doing it, showcasing that it can work. We have our single market to make it work. Yes, we need to work on that continuously and to show the business case. Because I think through that, we can really talk to our partners, other countries, to also get them to understand that, an economic future that is less emission intensive and also much more resilient, unfortunately, to what will be happening on the side of climate impacts is a promising future. And I mean, the partnerships will be a very, very important element to really bring that together and to make those partnerships work in practice. To also, I mean, we understand the concerns also there on mining, on critical raw materials. Is it all for us, for Europe, or what is in it for them? I mean, we're very much attentive also to that. So it is about showcasing that this is a prosperous, a common future that we could put in place if we work together. And let's hope we can get on with that in the next 5 years.
Thank you. And now I'd like to hand over to our audience. So we have, I think, a microphone going around. Please raise your hand. Keep the questions short and introduce yourself, please, and stand up. And I'll start with the gentleman in the front row here.
Yes, do you hear me?
Yes.
Maxime Bureau, I'm from 3M Company, so we do post-it notes, but we do a lot of things for energy and transportation. Thanks for your good remarks. One thing, and you mentioned simplification. Well, let's continue. For us, we see stick to the goals, focus on execution, help business to do more for serving public policy in Europe. So I think that's, you mentioned permits, you mentioned regulations. I think we all agree on that. My question, I was also at the COP with Roger, and we met at the COP, some of us. You're right, we should be very positive. Actually, the COP, the UN is a fantastic meeting place. And the COP, when we go there, it's fantastic to see everybody. My question now, I agree with the minister, it's a complicated world. You have 300 billion times 3. So it's not so bad, actually. So my question to all of you, how do you see this money being spent? Because for me, 300 billion seems a lot of money. So I don't know, there was no explanation how it will be spent. And not a lot, at least. So I don't know if you can give clarity on that here, or suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know how many of you were involved in the COP process, but is there anyone who wants to take that question?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure it's up to us to tell developing countries how to spend it, but I think it's clear when it comes to, for instance, resilience and adaptation, that there's a huge issue there. This is really about survival for many of them. And I mean, we've seen it in Europe to a certain certain scale, but this is really, for instance, about whole islands that are going to disappear because of climate change and rising sea levels. So, I mean, for me, that's really a big part of the agenda that is quite clear. You know, how to make sure that adaptation and resilience is being financed. But then, of course, it's also about decarbonization and making sure that indeed, we all together lessen our emissions. So, I mean, that to me would be the agenda, but I also think it's not really up to us as Europe to tell those other countries how to spend it.
Yeah. We have time for a second question, perhaps. The lady in the front row here, like. No. Yep. Thanks.
Thank you. My name is Lisa Jensen. I work at the European Parliament's Research Service on Climate Policy, and my question is for Yvonne. Sia just mentioned that the Clean Industrial Deal is expected at the end of February. And in the hearings of Commissioner Hoekstra, he said, well, he would not commit to 100 days for the 2040 revision, which has also not been promised, so that's fair, I guess. But do you expect it to still come in the first quarter, which is what is still on the Have Your Say page? It said expected Q1. But as he wanted to make sure that there is alignment with the Clean Industrial Deal, are we still expecting it in the first quarter, or is it before summer? Or thank you.
If only I could tell you. I think we're quite keen ourselves to see, because we, of course, always have a lot of process steps to go through. I mean, I think what is important is to keep in mind that, as we have all been saying, I mean, predictability is important, so this should come soon. Of course, it is about, that is one element in this overall Clean Industrial Deal. Where are we heading to? What are the measures needed to do this, not just for 2030, but also for 2040 and for climate neutrality in 2050? So there is definitely an inherent logic, and I think that's what Commissioner Hoekstra was trying to refer to. Okay, when it comes exactly is another thing. The other element is that for the next COP in Belém end of next year, Europe is also expected to bring forward a new European nationally determined contribution. So this will be, in principle, based on the 2040 target that we will put forward for the European climate law. And these things go hand in hand. So yeah, we better start talking about it. It should better be out there. We did it on purpose to bring out this communication in February this year so that we could already start talking about it. But now we also want to enshrine it into legislation so that there is this certainty. And well, as far as we're concerned, the sooner the better.
Manuel briefly wants to comment.
No, definitely. Yes, I mean, there is a point of domestic certainty for investment and for driving climate action in Europe, but I did want to stress the international kind of landscape and perspective, where this COP was a difficult COP. The EU showed up on some aspects, but I do notice that this came just after the US elections, where I think attention, the risk on international cooperation and climate action, I think, are there. And the EU does need to kind of respect its commitments, including proposing its new target before February. This was the plan, and it does need to signal that Europe is still in on climate action. Yes, there's some good signals, but it is also muffled by kind of headlines on the Green Deal instead. And I think it's just a matter of self-interest as well to show the rest of the world that the EU is still in on this. So,
thank you. And on that note, I'm afraid we're running out of time. I'm sorry to only take 2 questions. A lot of work ahead from the sounds of it. Thank you so much to our panelists for a great discussion. I just want to inform you that now there's a networking break. There is also in room B, our research and analysis division is presenting a research paper on investment shortfalls regarding the risk they pose to EU climate goals. We resume the session here in the room at 11:30 with a panel on carbon removals and carbon storage. Thank you so much. Thank you.
united in diversity. We are very heterogeneous in our opinion.
If we do not renew our partnerships with the rest of the world, Europe will not be relevant.
We can make it if we are together as Europeans.